So how do you put line on a fishing pole? What line do you use? Do you use a fluorocarbon leader? How do you adjust the drag? Let's talk about all that stuff. Intro. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Dishes and Fishes, where I show you how to cook and set hooks. In today's episode, we're talking about reels, line, and leaders. Let's get into it. So let's start with spinning reels. As a general rule of thumb, I always like to throw braided line on a spinning reel. I think it casts further, it's very, very sensitive, and a lot of the time on these finesse presentations, you may not necessarily detect the bite. So by throwing it with high vis braid, you're able to see your line, and the line will jump and it'll twitch, and you're able to see the bite actually occur as opposed to feeling it, which is great. So all my spinning reels have braided line on them. So you're probably asking yourself, Tyler, what's up with the monofilament line on that spool then? So anytime I spool a spinning reel with braided line, I always put a little 10 to 12 cranks of monofilament backing on the spool. That's gonna prevent it from kind of unspooling, being loose on there, and it just makes it a lot neater in my opinion. I have a giant spool of monofilament that I've had for like 6 years that I just use for backing on spinning reels. So now that I have my backing on, I will just tie a simple braided line to fluorocarbon connection knot right here, probably an Albright knot just because it's the fastest. And ideally you're not gonna work your braided line down to that point in the reel anyway, so it'll stay buried for a long time. So now I have my spinning reel with my backing and my braided line on it. I always use a fluorocarbon leader on the braided line on my spinning reels. I fish for smallmouth a lot of the time with finesse presentations that I use spinning reels for, and I find that they're a little bit line shy, especially in the really high pressured lakes in Connecticut that I fish. So fluorocarbon leaders are designed to make your bait less detectable. The fluorocarbon line is virtually invisible underwater. That's the whole idea. So if you're fishing in a place that has very, very high water clarity, you definitely want to be making sure that you have fluorocarbon line attached directly to your bait. Most of the time I'm going to be using 8, 10, or 12 pound braided line attached to 8 to 10 pound fluorocarbon leader on this finesse setup. I always use the FG knot when it comes to attaching my braided line to my fluorocarbon line. It flies through the guides very easily and it's strong. I have a video where I tested the strength of various braided to fluorocarbon fishing knots. Check that out and you'll see why I use the FG knot. So once I have my fluorocarbon leader attached to my braided line, the last thing I'll do is set the drag. The drag function is honestly most important when it comes to spinning reels. These rods aren't gonna horse fish around. They're not really strong. You are going to kind of work the fish back to the boat. Not necessarily tire it out, but you have to kind of be patient with it and steer it around. So you want to make sure that the drag does require some force to move, but it's able to be unspooled in the event that your PB smallie or a big pike pulls it out. You never want it to be tight to the point where it barely spins. That's gonna put a lot of stress on your braid to fluorocarbon leader knot. If you have a sharp hook, ideally you'll be all set, but again, make sure that it will spin freely like that when you apply some force. And that's spinning rods. Now let's talk about bait casters. So there's certain scenarios when you're using bait casting equipment that you can use straight braid, you can use straight fluorocarbon, or you can use braid to fluorocarbon. Let's talk about all three. So when I use straight fluorocarbon line, it's on a rod where I'm throwing a lot of subsurface high tension lures, like lipless crankbaits, jerk baits, things that I want to be under the water, and I'm also going to be working them fast, applying a lot of force to them. Fluorocarbon line sinks, so lures that I want to make sure get down far enough, I throw with straight fluorocarbon. So when do I use straight braid? Braided line floats, so I use braided line on all my topwater setups. If you use a braided to fluorocarbon connection on a topwater walking bait, you'll find that your line will kind of get caught in the treble hooks sometimes. That's because the fluorocarbon line is sinking and getting snagged by the hooks. So if you want to get rid of that, tie your braided line directly to your walking bait. And obviously this concept's pretty self-explanatory for a bait like a frog where you're not concerned with hiding it. You want to just rip the fish out of the lily pads as soon as it eats the frog, straight braid to the frog, and you're just winching it back to the boat. And the other scenario where you can throw straight braid is when the water is super murky and it doesn't really matter if you're hiding the bait or not because the fish can't see your line anyway. So if you can get away with throwing straight braid, whether that be top water or when the water is very murky, or honestly if it's in a very underfished area and the fish don't care, throw straight braid. I usually have 1 or 2 rods with straight fluorocarbon, and the rest I'll do braided to fluorocarbon for a few reasons. First of all, braided line lasts me 1 year, sometimes 2 years, and I'm super cheap. It costs a lot of money to spool all these rods, over $100 if you're putting all new line on all of them. So I don't want to honestly spend that every year. Like the braided line on this spinning rod, I already got 1.5 years out of, and you can see it faded in color a little bit. That's fine, I can still see it when a fish bites it. But again, if I were to spool up all these rods every year, it would cost me a lot of money, and I'm cheap, and I have no sponsors. So I spool most of my stuff with braid, and I tie leaders on depending on what I'm throwing. The most obvious reason, like I already talked about, that you want to use a braided line to fluorocarbon connection is when you want to hide your presentation. So in clear water scenarios, the fluorocarbon line is pretty invisible. And honestly, for me, the braided line to fluorocarbon connection has pretty good sensitivity, and I'm really comfortable fishing with it. I'm able to detect a lot more bites as opposed to just fishing fluorocarbon or monofilament. But for me, the most important reason is the braided line spool lasts me multiple seasons. I'll just replace the leader line every time I go fishing. And if I want to throw a straight braid, I'll just cut the leader off and send it. So we talked about straight fluorocarbon, we talked about straight braid, we talked about fluorocarbon to braid. So I saw some questions on Facebook about people that were hesitant to throw bait casting equipment because they didn't know how to adjust it. So I want to talk about that next. So let's start with the brakes. Leave it. No, my dog thinks this is a dog toy. It's a man toy. So all bait casting reels have brakes on the opposite side of the handle usually. They're either centrifugal brakes or they're magnetic brakes. But they're designed to slow the spinning of the spool down in the event that you're fishing in high wind or with light lures, or just unfavorable casting conditions, I guess. So if you're just starting out, what I would recommend doing is turning the brakes all the way to max or the highest level. This is gonna help you in the event that you're just starting out using bait casting equipment, and I will explain how to adjust that once you cast a few times. Who's here? Go see who's here. The next thing you want to adjust, got her out of the way, is this spool tension knob. So here's how the spool tension knob works. I'm gonna tighten it the whole way. I press my button, and you'll see nothing happens because that knob is applying a lot of tension to the spool. So how you properly set it is with the spool release button clicked in. I'm gonna loosen it until my bait falls freely like that. So you can see my bait is falling pretty slowly. If you want to increase your casting distance, loosen it more. So I'm gonna loosen it a few more turns. And now you can see it's falling even faster. And honestly, I like to keep that pretty loose because it's gonna get the most out of your casting distance. If you're fishing on a given day, I would adjust the spool tension knob so your bait falls freely like that, and I would turn your brakes the whole way up. Then I would cast it, and if you don't experience backlash, I would back this off a little bit, cast again, back this off a little bit, and I would keep backing the settings down until you experience backlash, and then I would just tighten them a little bit. That's gonna give you the max casting distance with that rod and that given lure. And that's how you properly adjust the casting settings on your bait caster. The last adjustment on a bait casting reel is the drag, also known as a star drag sometimes, but it's right here as opposed to on top of the reel like a spinning reel. And if you're using straight braid and it's like 20 or 30 pound test, honestly, you're gonna wanna just jack that drag the whole way up because that line is not gonna break unless you snag like a great white shark or something, or you fray it on some zebra mussels. But generally, if you're using straight braid, you can turn the drag up really, really high. So this isn't gonna move very much. If you're using straight fluorocarbon, you can honestly put it pretty high as well, depending on the pound test. If you're using 12-pound fluorocarbon, which honestly can get most jobs done in the fishing world, I would put my drag kinda tight, but I would make sure that it can be pulled freely a little bit in the event that you hook a slob. And with a braided line to fluorocarbon connection, you're gonna wanna adjust the star drag so this is tight, but you're able to unspool it a little bit. And that's gonna come down to feel and practice. But basically, never have your drag ultra tight unless you are fishing braided line straight to a lure. And that's pretty much it, guys. That's how I spool my rods, and that's how I make decisions when it comes to fluorocarbon, braided line, or both. So if you wanna see anything either in the kitchen or on the bass boat, please leave a comment and I will try to make a video on it. I want to help my followers as much as possible. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.